Welcome to the Deep Dive. Ready to dive deep into the brain. Today we're talking about how our brains actually work. We all hear about neurons, but how do these little cells create our thoughts, our memories, and everything we do? That's where this idea of dynamical systems comes in. We're going to be looking at a research review. It's called Dynamical Systems, Attractors, and Neural Circuits. And basically we're trying to figure out the brain's operating system. It's a pretty fascinating challenge.
Yeah, it really is. It's like imagine trying to figure out how a computer works.
Yeah.
But you can only look at the electrical currents flowing through the circuits. Like we can measure the currents, but how do those currents actually turn into computations? You know what I mean? Like what's the logic, the algorithms? That's the real puzzle.
Right, so we can record the activity of individual neurons, but it's only a tiny glimpse of what's really going on. Like try to understand a whole orchestra, but you can only hear a couple instruments.
Exactly. That's why this whole idea of the brain as a dynamical system is so important. We have to look beyond just individual neurons and think about how they're all working together and how that changes over time.
Okay, so remind me, what exactly is a dynamical system?
Well, simply put, it's anything that changes over time.
Yeah.
Think of something like a swinging pendulum. The position and speed are always changing, right? But it follows this predictable pattern. Now imagine a network of neurons all influencing each other. That's a dynamical system too, but way more complex, obviously.
So our brains aren't literally swinging like pendulums, but the idea of this kind of pattern change over time, that applies.
Yeah, exactly.
So what kinds of patterns are we talking about in the brain? This article mentions these things called attractors, which honestly sound kind of mysterious.
Yeah, attractors. It's a really fundamental concept when we talk about dynamical systems. They basically represent stable states that the system tends to settle into. Let's start with the simplest type, a point attractor. Imagine like a ball at the bottom of a bowl. No matter where you push that ball, it always rolls back to the bottom right. That's the stable state.
Okay, but how does a ball in a bowl translate to the brain? Are you saying our brains are just stuck in these stable states all the time? That doesn't sound very dynamic.
Right. Well, it's not that our brains are always in one fixed state. Think about the overall firing rate of a group of neurons. Like individual neurons might be firing sporadically, but the average activity level can be stable. Like, think of the average speed of cars on a highway.
Oh, okay. So there's stability at a higher level, even if the individual neurons are kind of doing their own thing.
Yeah.
But how does this whole idea of stable states relate to something like memory?
Okay, so that's where it gets really interesting. Imagine that you have multiple bowls now, or multiple point attractors. Within a neural circuit, each bowl represents a different memory. When you're remembering something, your brain activity settles into that corresponding bowl, or that attractor state.
So if I'm remembering my last birthday party, my brain activity is literally settling into a particular pattern, like a ball rolling into a specific bowl. Well, I need a second to process that.
Yeah, it's a pretty powerful concept, and it helps explain how memories can kind of persist even when there are distractions.
Wait, are you saying those distracting thoughts? They're like nudging the ball, trying to push it out of its little memory bowl, but the attractor is strong enough to keep it there.
Exactly. The deeper the bowl, the stronger the attractor, and the more resistant that memory is to being interfered with. This is like one way point attractors could help explain how we can hold information in working memory.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. So my brain's like a landscape with all these memory bowls scattered around, and my thoughts are like balls rolling between them. But what about memories that aren't so clear-cut, like remembering a specific location? Does that still work with the bowl analogy?
That's a great question. Not all memories are like discrete events. What about things like spatial memories, like remembering where something is on a map? That's where this idea of marginal states comes in, or sometimes they're called continuous attractors. So instead of a ball in a bowl, imagine a ball rolling along a track. The ball can move freely along the track, right? It represents this continuous range of values.
Okay, so instead of separate bowls for each location, it's more like a single long track that represents like the whole space.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the ball's position on the track, that would be like a specific location within that space. So it gives you a much more fine-grained representation of memory.
Okay, I get that. But isn't that kind of a delicate balancing act? What keeps the ball from rolling off the track? I mean, in the brain. Wouldn't all the random neural activity cause the ball to drift away from the correct location?
Yeah, that's a good point. Maintaining a perfectly smooth, level track in the brain, that would be pretty much impossible. But remember, we're dealing with this really complex, interconnected system, right? So instead of a single perfect track, think of it more like a bumpy road. tiny little dips and hills along the way.
Okay, so more like a real-world road than this idealized track. But how does that actually help? Wouldn't those bumps just make the ball bounce around randomly?
Well, that's where the magic of the brain's network dynamics comes in. Those imperfections, the bumps in the landscape, they might actually contribute to stability because the ball can get trapped in those little dips. It keeps it from drifting too far off course.
Hmm. So the imperfections actually make the system more robust, not less.
Exactly. And this bumpiness. It could also explain why our memories are sometimes fuzzy or imprecise. If the ball's bouncing around a bit in that dip, the corresponding memory wouldn't be as precise as if it were like sitting perfectly still at the bottom of a deep bowl.
Fascinating. I'm starting to see how these different types of attractors, they can actually work together to create this like rich and flexible memory system.
Yeah.
Okay, but this article also mentions oscillations. What are those? And how do they fit into all of this?
Ah, yes, oscillations. They're kind of like the rhythmic heartbeat of the brain. We see them everywhere at all these different frequencies. And they have all these different patterns. They're basically patterns of neural activity that repeat over time, kind of like a wave.
Right, like brain waves, like alpha waves and delta waves and all that. Are those
Yeah.
examples of oscillations?
Yeah, exactly. And they seem to play a really crucial role in all sorts of different brain functions. For instance, theta oscillations in the hippocampus, which is this brain area that's really important for memory and learning. Those seem to be involved in things like spatial navigation. It's like the brain is using these rhythmic waves to coordinate activity and synchronize different brain regions.
So in some cases, these oscillations aren't just background noise. They're actually carrying meaningful information.
Exactly. Although there's still a lot we don't understand about how oscillations contribute to brain function. Just because we see an oscillation doesn't necessarily mean that it's doing something important.
Right, right. Correlation doesn't equal causation. But it is pretty intriguing to think of these rhythmic waves,
Yeah.
like a kind of internal clock or conductor for the brain's orchestra.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got attractors, we've got oscillations. What other fascinating dynamical systems are hiding in the brain?
Well, hold on to your hat because now we're venturing into the realm of chaos.
Chaos. Wait a minute, isn't that a little bit, well, chaotic? How can our brains be chaotic and still function in a reliable way? Wouldn't that lead to totally unpredictable behavior? Like I might suddenly decide to just do a backflip in the middle of this recording.
Uh-huh. Well, that's a fair point. It's true that chaotic systems are highly sensitive to their initial conditions. A tiny change in one part of the system can lead to huge consequences somewhere else, like the butterfly effect. But here's the thing. Chaos doesn't necessarily mean randomness.
So you're saying there's a method to the madness?
Exactly. Chaotic systems can exhibit these incredibly complex and beautiful patterns. And while they're sensitive to those initial conditions, they're not totally unpredictable. Think of it like a river flowing downstream. It might encounter rocks and bends along the way, but it's still following the contours of the riverbed.
Okay, so it's not just pure randomness. But how can a chaotic system actually be useful in the brain?
Well, chaotic systems are incredibly adaptable and flexible. They can quickly switch between different states, which allows for a really wide range of behaviors. And through learning, they can actually be tamed to perform these complex tasks.
So it's like the brain is harnessing the power of chaos, using it to its advantage.
Exactly. And there's some evidence that suggests that certain brain regions, like the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in things like planning and decision making, that those regions might actually operate in this chaotic regime. It's a pretty mind-boggling concept. But it seems that chaos might actually play a crucial role in our ability to adapt and respond to a world that's constantly changing.
Wow, this is really pushing the limits of my understanding. So we've got attractors for stability, we've got oscillations for rhythm, and even chaos for flexibility. But the article also mentioned something called heteroclinic sequences. What are those? That sounds even more complex than chaos.
Uh-huh. Heteroclinic sequences are fascinating. Imagine a landscape. But this time, it has several shallow dips. Each dip represents an unstable state. Instead of settling into one of those dips, the ball rolls between them. It follows a specific sequence.
So it's like a dynamic dance between these different unstable states. But how does that translate to brain function? What are those unstable states actually representing?
That's a great question. Think of it like a decision-making process. Each unstable state could represent a different option. And in the heteroclinic sequence, that would represent the brain's exploration of those options before settling on a final choice.
Okay, that's starting to make sense. So it's not just about finding a single stable state. It's about navigating between different possibilities.
Exactly. And then to add yet another layer of complexity, there's also this concept of criticality.
Criticality, what does that mean when we're talking about the brain?
So imagine a system. It's poised right at the edge of chaos, perfectly balanced between order and randomness. That's criticality. It's a state where the system is incredibly sensitive to any changes, and it's capable of really rapid adaptation and really complex information processing.
So it's like the brain is walking this tightrope
Mm.
between stability and flexibility.
Precisely. And there's some evidence that suggests that the brain, it might actually operate near this critical point, which allows for this optimal information processing.
Wow, my brain is definitely feeling a bit critical right now. There's a lot to take in. But I'm starting to appreciate the incredible diversity of all these dynamical systems that play in the brain. It's not just one thing. It's like a whole symphony of interacting forces.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Mhm.
We're really only just beginning to understand the intricate interplay of all these systems and how they actually give rise to our thoughts, our memories, and our behaviors.
So where does all this leave us? We've covered so much ground today, from attractors to oscillations, even to the mind-bending concept of chaos in the brain.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in for sure. But I think the main takeaway is that our understanding of how the brain works, it's constantly evolving. We're kind of like explorers charting this vast, uncharted territory. We've discovered some incredible landmarks, these different dynamical systems, but there's still so much left to explore.
Yeah, it's like we've only just scratched the surface of what the brain is capable of. And the fact that there are all these different systems interacting, attractors, oscillations, chaos, criticality, it's almost overwhelming to think about.
It really is remarkable. But it's important to remember that these systems, they're not mutually exclusive. It's likely that the brain is using a combination of them, depending on the task at hand, the specific brain region involved, and even the individual's unique experiences.
Right. So it's not like one system is right and the others are wrong. It's
Yeah.
more like a toolbox with different tools for different jobs.
Exactly. And the exciting part is that we're still discovering new tools and figuring out how they all work together. This research is really opening up entirely new ways of thinking about how the brain functions.
It makes you wonder what other amazing discoveries are still out there. What other secrets are hidden inside this complex, dynamic organ?
Well, that's the beauty of science, isn't it? It's this never-ending quest for knowledge. And when it comes to the brain, I have a feeling we've only just begun to unravel its mysteries.
Speaking of mysteries, is there a final thought-provoking question we can leave our listeners with? Something to ponder as they go about their day.
I have one. Imagine if we could somehow observe the activity of every single neuron in the brain, like simultaneously. What kind of dynamical system would we see? Would it be one of the ones we've talked about today, or would it be something completely new and unimaginable?
Wow. That is a big question. I don't know the answer.
Yeah.
But I'm definitely going to be thinking about that for a while. It really makes you realize just how much we still don't know about the brain.
And that's what makes it so fascinating, right? The brain is like the ultimate frontier of scientific exploration.
Well, thank you so much for taking us on this incredible journey into the world of dynamical systems in the brain. It's been a truly eye-opening experience.
My pleasure. It's always exciting to share the wonders of neuroscience.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity about the incredible potential of your own brain. Keep exploring, keep learning, and never stop asking questions. Until next time, happy diving.